Devastating damage unleashed on Japan by the earthquake and tsunami which followed is putting huge strains on the world's third largest economy. How will Japan recover from the disaster? Will it be able to regain the world's confidence? And how long will that take? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. It's 2 weeks since the magnitude 9.0 earthquake and 10-metre tsunami struck the northeast coast of Japan. Hundreds of thousands of people are still homeless. More than 500,000 households do not have water, and workers are still battling to gain control of the Fukushima nuclear power plant. Fears of contaminated food are spreading overseas as officials report traces of radiation in milk products, seawater and 11 kinds of locally grown vegetables. The latest pictures showing extensive damage to the Fukushima nuclear power plant from Japan's earthquake and tsunami 2 weeks ago. Work resumed on Thursday to try to restore power to the plant after engineers were evacuated for nearly a day after black smoke began pouring out of the facility. Elevated levels of radiation have been found outside the 30-kilometre zone around the plant. The World Health Organization says it has serious concerns about the contamination of vegetables and milk. Food makes up 1% of Japan's exports, according to World Bank data. The government says it's aiming to ensure any produce that may have been affected by radiation does not leave the country. But still, around 20 nations have moved to stop or at least test Japanese imports. The United States has blocked all milk, fruit and vegetables coming from the radiation zone. Hong Kong has banned food and milk products from the Fukushima area after samples of turnips and spinach showed contamination levels 2.6 to 10 times above permissible limits. And Thailand is testing all fruit and veg, asking distributors to avoid or reduce meat, dairy products, seafood and seaweed. Persisting fears over the nuclear plant are affecting the Japanese stock market. Share prices are proving sensitive to reports of contamination and in the long term could fall under the weight of the damage from the disaster. The Japanese government has estimated that damage to the country's infrastructure and economy to be over $300 billion, making it the world's costliest natural disaster. Some analysts warn that figure may rise the longer the nuclear crisis continues. One of the biggest challenges will be finding the finance without expanding a public debt that's already the largest in the industrialized world. And on top of this is the human cost, which is immeasurable. The confirmed death toll on Thursday stood at 9,700, with another 16,500 still missing. Hundreds of thousands of survivors are homeless. Rebuilding and recovering will be a true test of Japan's strength. Well, to try to judge just how well equipped Japan is to cope with the enormous fallout, we're joined by our three guests in Hong Kong. Andrew Leong, Asia economist and business strategist. In Tokyo, Ger-hard, Chief Executive Officer of Eurotechnology Japan. And in Washington, D.C., Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Centre. Gentlemen, all, thank you very much for joining us and welcome to the programme. Ger-hard, if I could start by drawing on your experience there in Japan over the past 2 weeks. Just give us an idea of the extent that this disaster has affected the whole country.
Okay, first I want to turn your question into present tense because the crisis hasn't stopped yet. The afterquakes are still continuing. I think we should add that to your introduction. We had about 300 magnitude 5 quakes which followed the initial very strong force 9.1. So it's still, you know, a lot of everybody working in the area here still has every day several strong quakes, you know. So there's a big psychological impact. The other issues are we have electricity cuts here, which because of the discipline of the population haven't all been implemented, but they are planned. And so there's a big uncertainty, are we going to have electricity this afternoon or not? And that affects also the production. So a big impact on the production, industrial production, are the electricity cuts. You know, TEPCO, it's the biggest utility on Earth. It's the electricity provider here for the Tokyo region and east of Japan. They have about a shortfall of 25% in electricity. So that is a very big impact, maybe the biggest impact economically. If
I could just pick up on that point of power cuts, because one thing that wasn't mentioned in that report is the effect that's been had on the auto and the electronics industry. I mean, a huge part of Japan's exports, and in the past has been seen to have a very direct effect on the health of Japan's economy. I mean, Toyota has been saying it's lost production of some 140,000 vehicles since March 14th. So what impact does that have on the overall economy?
The estimates are that I think it will affect the GNP by maybe 5% over the next year or so. But the effect on the GDP is not that simple, because there are several factors. I mean, one factors are the direct impact that, you know, that Toyota closes the factories. But then we have a human impact. People died. Some of them will have been experts, you know, who are missing in the important positions they had. Then we have the electricity cuts, which affect the productivity in the whole region here. We have shortages of food, we have shortages of, which is not that serious actually, there's enough to eat here. On the other hand, of course, the reconstruction has already started, and the reconstructions means an increase of GDP. And it could even long-term increase the productivity if old factories were destroyed, which are replaced now by new factories. And the state-of-the-art factories are built earthquake-proof anyway, so I don't think the state-of-the-art factories are that affected by the earthquakes. But they are affected, of course, by electricity cuts.
Indeed. Bruce Klingner, over there in the US, we've seen Toyota say that it's had to slow its production at some of the US plants due to a shortage of parts, and indeed that the full impact of the disaster has yet to be felt. I mean, we're also seeing Sony, Toshiba, Canon, all very big household names saying they are lacking parts. Do you think we're going to see a global shortage of such goods?
Well, I don't know about a shortage, but certainly a restriction. And cars and conductors will be, semiconductors will be two of the largest areas. And Japanese production for so many consumer electronic products is so pervasive that I think we'll see a continuing impact on not only Japanese producers in the United States, but also U.S. producers who use Japanese componentry.
And Andrew Leung, if I can draw you in here into the discussion, because this could benefit other countries in Asia as markets look for parts elsewhere. Do you think we could see other markets jumping in to fill the void?
Well, a lot of the manufacturing in the world has been outsourced to China, but China depends on a lot of high-end imports and components from countries like Japan. So the disruption to the global supply chain, even though it is centered on China, is highly disruptive in the short term. But of course, in the medium term, the high-end components could be, they could find other substitutes in other countries, other advanced countries. But this is not going to happen overnight. But I think that what is hidden beneath the current crisis is that the high level of toxicity in the kind of fuel, which is not commonly well known, perhaps in reactor number 3, because there's a mixture between plutonium and uranium, which is called MOX, M-O-X, mixed oxide. It is 2 million times more toxic than ordinary uranium fuel. And that's why you see and also the scary thing is that it would not have an immediate impact on the kind of radiation levels. So just measuring the radiation levels would not actually come close to grasping the kind of impact on the kind of toxicity is spreading around the world. So I think that that's the medium term. That's very, very worrying. In the long term, of course, in the medium term, oil prices are coming up, and Japan is likely to import more energy. And then with what's happening in the Middle East, with the turmoil in the Middle East, it's going to drive up oil prices, shortages, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely. I just wanted to jump in there because, Ger-hard, are you
right.
seeing a debate on the future of nuclear policy there in Japan?
I think the Japanese government is very, very committed to nuclear energy. I don't think that there's a discussion. I haven't seen much discussion now about alternatives. And, you know, like an area of Tokyo needs such a high amount of energy that I can't really see a good alternative to that. One thing which is a bit underdeveloped in Japan, for example, I think is wind power. But I think in the case of nuclear power stations here, we have to also consider that a big part of the plant which is now in crisis is 40 years old. It's very, very old, and it was already written off. And I think there will be a very strict review of what led to this accident. And, you know, I've lived 20 years now in Japan. There was a big, I've seen, this is the third big quake which I experienced now. The first one was in Kobe, and the second one was in Niigata, and the third one is now. And each time certain weaknesses have appeared in the, in the infrastructure here, and they have been corrected. Like, for example, after the Kobe earthquake, Japan became aware that, there was the national disaster management was not perfect at that time and caused additional deaths and also damage. And it was very clear that that needed to be improved. And that has been improved very, very much. So I think compared to the Kobe earthquake, the government, the way the government manages the crisis and how fast it responded was much, much better than in the Kobe earthquake. The other point about the Kobe earthquake was that the building regulations were tightened up very much, and for many years after the Kobe earthquake, motorways and railways and bridges and also some buildings were reinforced. And, you know, if we look at the positive sides, you know, in the Tokyo area, you have about 30 million people living. And Tokyo was subjected on the 11th of March to a magnitude 6 earthquake. And if I understood it well, I think only 2 or 3 people died as a function of this as a consequence of this magnitude 6 earthquakes. And this is really very, 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 very astonishing how safe Tokyo was really, or is.
Of course, they're still looking at the, in fact, just jumping, because they're still looking at the nuclear crisis that has not been solved yet. And just a little earlier, Al Jazeera asked the spokesman of the World Health Organization just how serious is the threat of radiation to public health and food.
The Japanese are taking all the measures possible in order to stop food from affected areas being produced. If countries decide to do additional checks when the food arrives in order to reassure their own population, we understand that because of the emotiveness of the issue. On the other hand, we would not want these checks to start inhibiting international trade of food.
Bruce Klingner, do bans such as we've seen in the US only inflict unnecessary damage on consumers' confidence in Japan at a time when it needs the world to rally behind it?
Well, I think there's certainly going to be a question about mostly agricultural products coming from Japan. And right now, the United States has only restricted certain products from the area immediately around Fukushima. So I don't think there will be a widespread panic about even agricultural products if they are perceived to be from safe zones. But on another issue, in the nuclear debate here in the United States, a year ago, after the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, there was an increase in public support for nuclear energy, seeing it as a way of reducing our dependence on not only domestic oil, but certainly overseas oil, as well as environmentalists were actually pressing for that because as a way of reducing carbon emissions and climate change. Now, obviously, the images of smoke streaming from the reactors in Japan has raised concerns. And there will be greater uncertainty about the future of nuclear power here in the United States. That said, the Obama administration, since the Fukushima accident, has affirmed the U.S. commitment to building additional nuclear reactors, though I think, of course, there's going to be a slowing of any construction. There will be a requirement for additional reviews, perhaps additional safety measures to be implemented. And everything will be a bit on hold in order until after we see sort of the lessons learned from construction and response to the Fukushima disaster.
Okay, let's move along a little bit to look at the overall cost of recovery. And Japan has put this cost at the moment at more than $300 billion, the most expensive natural disaster in history. And this has come at a time when Japan has just emerged from recession. Andrew Leong, who's going to pay for this?
Well, I mean, 300 billion is a lot of money, but then to the Japanese economy, the third largest in the world, is not a be-all and end-all kind of game changer. But I think the most worrying thing is that, A, we're not too sure of the extent of the nuclear fallout. As I was mentioning about this very toxic kind of fuel, which is a lot of people do not realize how toxic it is and how quickly it can spread around the world. I mean, even recently, I mean, you can detect the kind of radiation contamination as far as Iceland and Finland. And so that's kind of scary there. And then secondly, the agricultural products, it can get into the food chain as even though they're banned from import, but the cattle would eat the kind of vegetables, and then fish could be contaminated, and the small fish could be eaten by big fish, and then the ocean currents would carry all this contamination around. So that's one side of the picture. The other side, of course, is the energy thing. I think that there is a nuclear power. I think I don't think the world will turn back on nuclear power 100%, especially in China, because the alternative of depending on fossil fuel, apart from climate change, raises the question of national energy security. So I think that is finding a safer fuel, find a safer nuclear fuel, finding a safer method of utilizing nuclear power, and building the institutional and management measures to make sure that's relatively safe. And I think that, for example, recently there was the use of thorium, Thorium, which is much safer than a mixture of plutonium and uranium. But this is only the beginning of a long battle. But I have no doubt that this is going to be a game changer in the energy field.
Ger-hard, this is a long battle. Is it one that Japan can win?
Japan can win, yes, of course. I mean, coming back to the previous discussion about the nuclear power stations, I think I cannot see how the world will abandon nuclear power now. I don't think that's going to happen. I think what's going to happen is that there will be a very thorough study of which mistakes led to this catastrophe, and then it will be a question of engineering to make sure that this particular constellation of mistakes and other imaginable problems will be engineered into the power stations. Now, back to your question, will Japan overcome? Oh yes, I think so. And I think, as you know, Japan has seen no economic growth for maybe the last 15 years or so because of structural issues. And for the last 15 years, Japan was just a very, very comfortable place to live. So the pressure to make the necessary structural changes was not strong enough. And this crisis now, I can hear from many sides now that, many Japanese younger people, especially younger leaders, CEOs of grown-up, startup companies which have become grown into big companies, they do push now for structural changes. And I think one of the silver lines on the horizon here will be that certain changes will be made. And another change which I've seen happening now is that, you know, Japan used to concentrate the power, the financial markets, the headquarters of companies, information, everything is in Tokyo. Japan is extremely centralized. And right now, at the moment, Tokyo has a lot of difficulties to do business right now. You know, the electricity cuts, transportations has been cut back to some extent. It's less reliable than it is normally. So there's some disadvantages in doing business now in Tokyo. So I can see companies which are not really necessary to be in Tokyo. They move to Sapporo, they move to Osaka. Some companies, they open, you know, emergency headquarters in Osaka or in Kobe, where they used to be some time ago, you know. Now they go back, and maybe they even move down there. And so I think if there's a push to decentralization in Japan, that will also help a lot.
So that's one more positive possible outcome. I just want to briefly touch on another regional impact. Bruce Klingner, Japan is clearly going to be inwardly looking for some time. Do you think that this is going to give China room to flex its muscles in ways perhaps that it mightn't before?
I think it will. Japan has been very insular the last many decades under the previous government, the LDP, and then even more so under the new government, the DPJ. When they came into office, they were complaining about wanting an equal alliance with the United States, though not wanting to assume any additional responsibilities. In the last year, because of both the North Korean and the growing Chinese threat, the government, the DPJ, switched many of its policies and adopted, I think, a more pragmatic security viewpoint. But clearly this disaster is going to make them more inwardly focused, not only with the role of the self-defense forces, but the politicians will be focused on disaster relief and response, as well as rebuilding Japan. And I think there will be certain issues, such as the Senkakus, that Japan will continue a very strong focus on vis-a-vis China. But there are other areas, I think, more along the periphery that China may feel emboldened to act a bit more aggressively than it has been even in the last year, and perhaps test Japan's resolve on some other issues.
Okay, we've just about run out of time. I do want to end on a question focusing on Japan. Andrew Long, this is a country that survived natural disasters, indeed World War II major disaster. Is it uniquely placed to cope with this?
I think China, in fact, like Japan, is part of the globalization story, and no country can entirely shut herself inwards. But I think as far as Japan is concerned, in the short term, Japan cannot rely just on domestic consumption, relying on a very strong yen. And I think this is going to have an impact on what the yen is going to do in order to grow the kind of maybe green energies and new types of technologies in which Japan has got an advantage. As far as China is concerned, of course, China depends on still the high-end components and the technologies from Japan. And as far as energy is concerned, in fact, China is facing a tremendous challenge in terms of energy efficiency and also green energies because of the pollution and because of the energy security of overdependence on imported oil from the world's most problematic areas, including Iran, in the Middle East, and also in certain countries in Africa. So I think that China would continue to rely on and expect the kind of cooperation from Japan on green energies. In fact, Japan is leading the world in energy efficiency. So I think to turn the Japanese economy around in the medium term to the long term, particularly as the whole world is focusing on energy security and cost of oil because of the Middle East, I think that Japan's advantage lies in this energy, highest level of energy efficiency per capita, and also the kind of technologies and which Japan can sell to the rest of the world, particularly China, and that, of course, would depend on the yen.
Okay.
The yen has been very, very strong. So I think that in the long term, there is something to be said about a weaker yen to grow its export-oriented technologies, green technologies in particular.
Indeed, we may well see a new Japan emerge on the world stage. That's the optimistic viewpoint. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. In Hong Kong, Andrew Leong; in Tokyo, Ger-hard Fassel; and in the US, Bruce Klingner. Thank you too for watching this edition of Inside Story. If you'd like to get involved in the discussion, please do email us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.